Hello and welcome to the Davos Online Roundtable on Reforms for Investment in Ukraine, an event that's looking forward to the URC2022 that will be taking place in Lugano, Switzerland in July. I'm Juliette Linley, I'm a Swiss journalist, and it is my pleasure to be your host here today. Now, please feel free to send in any questions you might have on Slido. The hashtag is URC2022. Make sure you say who you want your question answered by, and we will do our best to get to as many as we can. Now, we had all hoped to be at the World Economic Forum in person in Davos. That's not happening, but we're not going to let the pandemic stand in our way. So we've put together a great group of panelists. But before I introduce you to them, let me bring you a word of welcome from the President of Switzerland, Mr. Ignazio Cassis.
Mr. President Zelensky, Mr. Prime Minister Schmihal, Excellencies, Ladies and Gentlemen. Gerne hätte ich Sie alle diese Tage in Davos getroffen. Leider ist das aktuell aus bekannten Gründen nicht möglich. Umso mehr freut es mich, dass wir diesen virtuellen Anlass auf die Beine stellen konnten. Auch wenn wir uns anders gewünscht hätten, die Pandemie prägt unseren Alltag auch im neuen Jahr. Dennoch ist es wichtig, dass wir über die Pandemie hinausdenken, dass wir unseren Blick in die Zukunft richten. Als Gastgeberin der 5. Ukraine-Reformkonferenz, der URC2022, in diesem Sommer in Lugano, kann die Schweiz einen Beitrag zur Stabilität und zur Prosperität in Europa leisten. Ich freue mich, dass wir als langjährige Partnerin der Ukraine die Möglichkeit haben, das Land auf seinen Reformpfad zu unterstützen. Zusammen mit unseren ukrainischen Partnern und weiteren wichtigen Akteuren im Reformprozess haben wir entschieden, das Augenmerk auf einzelne Schwerpunkte zu legen, auf konkrete Ergebnisse und Maßnahmen. Präsident Zelensky, Ministerpräsident Schmihal und ich sind übereingekommen, unsere Aufmerksamkeit an der diesjährigen Ukraine-Reformkonferenz auf zwei thematische Pfeiler zu richten: Stabilität und Prosperität. Der erste Eckpfeiler, die Stabilität, beinhaltet Reformthemen wie Korruption ausschalten, lokale Strukturen fördern und die Kohäsion stärken. Der zweite Eckpfeiler, die Prosperität, beinhaltet ökonomische Reformen. In diesem Kontext steht der heutige Anlass. Er trägt das Motto Reformen für Investitionen und hat zwei Ziele. Die ukrainischen Behörden erläutern die Reformen in ihrem Land und erklären, wo sie die Schwerpunkte setzen und welches die nächsten Schritte sind. Und der Privatsektor kann darlegen, was seine Bedürfnisse sind und inwiefern Reformen grundsätzlich Bedeutung haben für ihre Investitionen. Der direkte Austausch zwischen den ukrainischen Behörden und den Investoren soll es ermöglichen, gegenseitige Erwartungen und gemeinsame Ziele zu diskutieren. Überlegungen, die der anschließenden Paneldiskussion entspringen, werden Eingang finden in die weitere Vorbereitung der Konferenz von Lugano. Damit die Ukraine-Reformkonferenz 2022 ein Erfolg werden kann, ist es wichtig, dass wir on the road to Lugano voranschreiten, auch wenn die Umstände durch die Pandemie erschwert sind. Im Oktober haben wir den Reformprozess in Kiew angestoßen. Mittlerweile sind die beratenden Gremien aktiv. Nach dem heutigen Anlass sind weitere Vorbereitungstreffen geplant, unter anderem in Brüssel und in Washington. Das Ziel: im Sommer können wir die Eckpfeiler für die nächsten Etappen im Reformprozess definieren. Ich freue mich, dass die Schweiz mit der Ukraine-Reformkonferenz 2022 neuerlich eine wichtige Konferenz im Interesse der internationalen Gemeinschaft ausrichten kann und dazu in meiner Heimat, dem Tessin. Meine Damen und Herren, ich bedanke mich bereits jetzt für Ihr Engagement. Auf bald in Lugano!
Indeed, we look forward to seeing everyone in Lugano, including the President of Ukraine, Mr. Volodymyr Zelensky, who sent us this message.
Шановний пане президенте Касіс, пані та панове, насамперед я хочу подякувати за ініціативу швейцарських партнерів провести сьогоднішній захід. Пандемія внесла корективи у формат нашої зустрічі, однак наш спільний інтерес і пріоритети залишаються незмінними. А саме, зробити все, щоб п'ята конференція з питань реформ в Україні стала спільним успіхом України та Швейцарії. Здійснені за останні роки реформи запустили процес глибокої трансформації України, який ми прагнемо далі розвивати. Тому дуже важливо, щоб конференція в Лугано ознаменувала перехід до нової філософії підтримки змін в Україні, підтримки системної трансформації. Над підготовкою конференції активно працюють урядові команди наших країн. Окремо я хочу відзначити чудову взаємодію з моїм колегою, президентом Касісом, з яким ми перебуваємо в тісному контакті. Упевнений, що сьогоднішній захід стане дуже важливим внеском у підготовку конференції в Лугано, яка продемонструє учасникам іншу Україну. Сучасну, динамічну, стійку Україну, Україну нових можливостей. Пані та панове, події, які останніми тижнями розгортаються довкола України, вкотре засвідчили унікальну роль України для Європи і її майбутнього. Ці події підтверджують, всеосяжна безпека в Європі неможлива без відновлення суверенітету та територіальної цілісності України. Я очікую, що результатом наших спільних зусиль, наших перемовин з Російською Федерацією стане деескалація ситуації на кордоні з Україною та гарантуванням керівництвом Росії досягнення миру на Донбасі. Попри всі труднощі, які нам доводиться долати, Україна сьогодні країна свободи, країна надії. Ми вже досягли багато на шляху трансформації, у тому числі за підтримки наших західних партнерів, включаючи Швейцарію. Ми створили прозорий ринок землі, започаткували надважливий процес деолігархізації, запровадили систему державних стимулів для великих інвестиційних проєктів. Ми розблокували реформу судової системи в Україні, і я роблю все можливе, щоб ми досягли успіху на цьому шляху. Бо верховенство права – це не лише запит суспільства на справедливість, це критично важлива передумова для успішного ведення бізнесу в Україні, залучення інвестицій та реалізації нових ідей. Вважаю, що конференція в Лугано має стати майданчиком для широкої дискусії за участю наших партнерів та бізнесу, як ми можемо зміцнити стійкість України і прискорити її трансформацію. Бо успішна Україна, інтегрована в європейський ринок – це запорука успішної і сильної Європи. Упевнений, що швейцарський бізнес і ті, хто присутні тут сьогодні, добре усвідомлюють можливості, що пропонує Україна. І не випадково Швейцарія у топ-5 іноземних інвесторів України. Упевнений, це не межа. Перетворення, які тривають в Україні, відкривають додаткові можливості для бізнесу, у тому числі швейцарського. Маємо амбітні плани на майбутнє. Вже ближчим часом планується запуск Дія Сіті, завдяки якому темпи зростання IT-сектору можуть подвоїтися. І буде продовжено реформу корпоративного управління і активізовано приватизацію державних підприємств. Особлива увага буде приділена розвитку інфраструктури. У планах початок комплексного відновлення систем зрощення на півдні України. Буде започатковано велику термомодернізацію, у рамках якої буде утеплено тисячі об'єктів житлового фонду та соціальної інфраструктури. Буде продовжено програму «Велике будівництво» з розбудовою якісних доріг європейського зразка. Я дуже розраховую, що швейцарський бізнес активно долучиться до реалізації проєктів, які втілюються у нашій країні. Кожний інвестиційний контракт – це дуже важливий внесок у трансформацію нашої держави, який ми дуже цінуємо. Сподіваюся, що на конференції в Лугано ми зможемо представити нові історії успіху швейцарських інвестицій в Україні. Дуже дякую всім за увагу.
Thank you so much, Mr. President. Now, allow me to introduce our panelists, starting in Kiev. We've got Mr. Denis Shmyhal. He is the Prime Minister of Ukraine. He's been in office for nearly 2 years, since March 2020. Welcome, Mr. Prime Minister. We're also joined... Welcome. We're also joined by Elena Kojarny. She's the founder and CEO of Horizon Capital, a private equity firm that she started in Kiev a number of years ago. Welcome, Ms. Kojarny. We're also joined in Kiev by Mr. Roman Washuk. He is a former Canadian ambassador. He is currently the ombudsman, business ombudsman in Ukraine. Welcome, Mr. Washuk. On the Swiss side, we're joined online by Mr. Ansgar Brockmeyer. He is Deputy CEO of Stadler Rail, a company that's looking to make a major investment in Ukraine. Welcome, Mr. Brockmeyer.
Good morning.
And finally, joining me here in Bern is Ms. Simone Wiesfedele. She is the CEO of Switzerland Global Enterprise, which helps Swiss SMEs, which supports them as they do business abroad. Welcome, Ms. Wies.
Welcome.
Okay, before we go any further, let me just take a moment to say that we are, of course, well aware of the geopolitical challenges that are currently facing Ukraine. This is neither the time nor the place to discuss those matters, but just allow me to say that it is forums precisely like this one that we can bring the focus back on what matters for Ukraine's prosperity and stability. So reforming the country and creating opportunities for investment that over time are what will directly impact the Ukrainian people. So I'd like to start with you, Mr. Prime Minister. Could you bring us up to speed on what are the latest reforms your government has been implementing, and most importantly, what can we expect will smooth the path for more direct foreign investment in the future? Over to you, Mr. Denis Shmyhal.
Дякую. Доброго дня.
Good afternoon, Presidents of Switzerland and Ukraine, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Ukrainian government, I'm happy to greet all the participants of this event, Reforms for Investments in Ukraine. And we are having it together with the Swiss Confederation government under the conference on Ukrainian reforms in Lugano that is to take place in Ukraine in Lugano this year, Switzerland. As President said, Switzerland is one of the biggest investors to the Ukrainian economy, and we highly appreciate support rendered by Switzerland for reform efforts in our country. The slogan of this conference, the fifth conference, reforms for everyone, everyone for reforms. This is openness of our government for most effective cooperation with all the stakeholders, and that means continuous interplay of the cabinet of ministers and the authorities of all kinds with civil society, general public, business community, and our international partners. Presently, understanding of reforms in Ukraine is inseparable from the Euro integration and Euro-Atlantic aspirations. And Ukraine is still very much committed to the association agreement, which presents the roadmap for reforms and integration of our country into the internal market of the EU, with freedom of services, persons, capital, and goods, in green transformation, digitalization, energy, transportation, development of economy, attraction of investments. This is one of the priority areas for our government's implementation of the association agreements, which will provide for attractive investments to Ukraine. This is one of the most important factors in this development. Let me dwell in my presentation here on the key results that Ukraine has in its economy and the investment sphere, the results of last year and plans for this year. In 2021, the government adopted the National Economic Strategy till 2030. And it was developed together with hundreds of experts, representatives of business and different sectors, analysts. The strategy presents the development for Ukraine in heavy industry, agri-business, innovation, infrastructure, internal transportation, energy sector, and other areas. I would like to say here that this is for the first time in Ukraine's history that we have this medium-term 10-year planning span, and we can see the prospects of next decade. One of the key vectors is competition for capital and providing preferences for big investments in Ukraine, into Ukraine. And last year, we launched a system of incentives for the big investment project, and it goes by name of Invest Nannies. Because of this system, Ukraine Invest Office, the governmental office, has been approached by more than 20 investors with investment projects at more than $2 billion in equivalent. And this is just the beginning. As we believe, as we can see, and we can say here that at the end of last December, 2 of the applications out of the 20 were received by the Ministry of Economy and are being reconciled and prepared for the implementation. Another achievement is opening of the land market for agricultural use from the time of the launch. As of mid-December last year, we had in Ukraine 66,000 agreements concluded for purchase of land, and this is just the beginning, which is opening the doors for many other opportunities for the agribusiness to grow by 2 times in 10 years, as we expect. After 9 months of 2021, the investments into agribusiness have increased by more than 30%, and that demonstrates that investors can see many prospects in the agri sector of Ukraine, and we are going to support this in the future. Last year, we created the Dear City platform for IT sector investments to develop the digital economy in Ukraine. We formed preferable conditions for introduction and innovation business in Ukraine. And we are talking here about development of the digital infrastructure, attraction of investment, attraction of innovation into the Ukrainian economy, attraction of talents. And we have seen increase by $1 billion yearly for recent period, and this is just the beginning. Again, another focus of our attention is downsizing of the role of state in the economy. We privatize. That's one area, privatization of the state-run enterprises, PPPs, public-private partnership in infrastructure and other areas, and high-quality reform of corporate governance at the enterprises. We are introducing this reform as for the top 15 state-run companies. This system is being brought into compliance with the standards of corporate governance adopted by OECD. And we have last year 345 privatization auctions at 5.4 billion hryvnias. That's the buffer indicator for last decade in privatization in Ukraine. In 2021, we also launched the incentives for development of industrial parks, simplified procedure for joining the electric grids, being connected, cheap, inexpensive money for SMEs through the program 579. We liquidated thousands of unnecessary regulations and introduced scores of new online services, which makes it impossible to use corruption against some business. And this is a great relief. Together with the old civilized world, we are embracing green transformation of our economy. And we share the goals of the green course, of the EU green course, the international efforts, the international strategy to this effect. One of the great achievements of 2021 was the dialogue we started at the highest level for Ukraine to join the European course based on the EU. We'll start our joint initiatives and interplay with the international partners for transformational coal mining regions. These are the very important and very urgent steps. In 2021, we achieved the record indicator for GDP, almost 200 billion US dollars in equivalent, and very high salary, more than 550 US dollars in equivalent. Export of our goods reached the record 68 billion US dollars, and we have achieved the starting position, good starting positions for economic growth, let's call that. Of course, to continue along these lines, we have to join this process, invite the civil society, business community to share and support the reforms that we jointly started and have been implementing. Let me discuss this in more detail as regards prospects for 2022 and the prospects for implementation of reforms in Ukraine. Generally speaking, we have very ambitious plans for next 2 years for integration to the European markets. We are talking about industrial, customs, digital transportation, and energy visa-free regimes with the EU. Each of them means concluding agreements and abiding by the European rules and standards, and that will provide for the Ukrainian economy additional billions of euros of investments, capital injections, and development. The program Big Construction, initiated by President of Ukraine, $5 billion US dollars to be invested next year for development of infrastructure. Under the same program, we will start the first concession motorway Krykovets-Lviv-Brody-Rivne. This is one of the main roads, main corridors for motorways in Ukraine, and will implement PPPs for the first time in the road infrastructure. This is just the beginning again, but it will provide for hundreds of millions of investments in dollar equivalent, US dollar equivalent, and thermal modernization. This is not just for making homes and establishments warmer, kindergarten, schools, to save energy, but this will be a great booster, as we expect, for the economy, because business will be also invited and actively participate, as we hope, and that will provide an excellent opportunity to develop our economy, our production, construction, civil works, and services of all sorts. This will be a multiplying factor as we see it. And in continuation of the reform that we started and was a great success of last year, this year we will add up to 8 billion hryvnias for the state budget for digitalization. A DSCT will be launched. This platform will provide for IT sector to double up to 40 to 50% growth a year, from 6 billion US dollars to 17 billion. That's the growth that we expect and hope for this sector. And we will have investment projects with considerable investments for the governmental office Ukraine Invest that will support invest application for this year for more than 1 billion US dollars, and accordingly for the newly adopted law on facilitation of such projects with the big investment. And we will further harmonize the Ukrainian legislation with the EU law in the energy sector. One of the key tasks is strengthening of the energy security of Ukraine, more investments, attractiveness, and engaging FDIs for reaching the goals of energy independence, decarbonization, and clean energy. We will work on synchronization of our policies with the EU Green Cause through climatic commitments and green switchover in the economy. That will be implemented through energy efficiency, fair transformation, coal mining regions, and participation of the European industrial alliances. And economic development for Donetsk and Luhansk regions for the period till 2030 will form territories of priority development there, industrial, agribusiness, infrastructural, and hospitality clusters, innovation centers, industrial parks. With the uncertainty that we see in the world economy and the energy crisis, one of the tasks for the government, one of the major ones, is macroeconomic stability. We will have to decrease the deficit of the budget, the state debt, sovereign debt, and we will continue cooperation with our international partners. We'll continue start new programs with the IMF, the EU for macro financial support, and all of it will be implemented 2022 and the following years. In closing, I would like to emphasize that the key achievements and implementation on the reforms I mentioned earlier became possible only with the support of our international partners and our active cooperation with them. We offer a very attractive market, highly qualified human capital, and favorable investment environment. We also aimed at keeping the pace of reform very active, making the growth better. Especially this is important when we have the looming aggression coming from the Russian Federation, strengthening of this aggression, implementing and successfully implementing the reforms. We hope to provide a sustainable economic growth and stability, not just for Ukraine, but all Europe. I would like to thank you for your attention, dear colleagues. I'm prepared to answer the questions and continue with the discussion here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Mr. Prime Minister. Clearly, a lot has been achieved. There is still a lot that needs to be done, of course. And I'd like to bring in Ms. Lena Kozharny, who's been active in the Ukrainian business community for many years. Ms. Kozharny, you run a leading private equity firm, and it has over $1 billion under management, and you're the chair of one of the leading business associations in the country. Can you please give us the macroeconomic and investment perspective as you see it on the ground?
Thank you. First, thank you so much. I'm so honored to be here. Thank you to the Swiss government, to the Ukrainian government for the opportunity to be on this panel. I'm excited to be sitting here in Kiev, Ukraine. And for those who know me, they know that I've lived in Ukraine for 28 years, that this has been really an amazing journey to watch from here on the ground. And I think what is very important to emphasize is that Ukraine should not be compared to countries that have received the European roadmap, that received $2 billion of infrastructure investment in every oblast, in every region. We really have to look at from where Ukraine has come and where Ukraine is today, and in that context, understand really where things stand in terms of a macroeconomic perspective. So I'm going to spend a few moments just really going through a few very important indicators that I think show the degree of transformation that we've certainly seen on the ground in the last 7 to 8 years. So if I would take you back to 2014-15, and really this crisis in Ukraine back in 2014-15 was the catalyst for the transformation, the reform process, for the acceleration. We saw the association agreement, the free trade agreement with Europe, and we saw this pivot, a pivot that was necessitated by external factors, but which, when we look back 8 years later, we see that actually set the groundwork for Ukraine to be very resilient going into the COVID-19 pandemic, coming out of it, and we expect that resilience to continue going forward. So if I take you back to 2014-15, it's hard to imagine sitting here in Ukraine today that at that point, the GDP was dropping 6.6% in 2014, 9% in 2015. The nominal GDP in Ukraine in 2015 was $91 billion. Fast forward to today, you've got growth of 3 to 4%. You've got nominal GDP at 195 billion, which is the highest nominal GDP in Ukraine's history. I mean, the highest in Ukraine's history, which we're seeing post 2021. And it's the first time that it's exceeded 180 billion since 2013. On the trade front, you had Ukraine back then, its number one trading partner was Russia. everybody understands that 25-30%. Its energy dependence was on Russia. Fast forward to today, EU is its #1 trading partner. Russia is less than 5%. No energy imports. They're all coming from the EU. That's a cardinal change between then and now. On the banking sector, that's very important because the banking sector is critical to stability. It underpins a country's stability. If we look back to what was going on in the banking sector, you had a central bank with a fixed, unsustainable Forex policy. That's very important because when the events occurred in 2014-15, the country lost 12 billion in reserves in 1 year. I mean, imagine losing 12 billion and hitting your lowest point with 1 month of import cover. Fast forward to today, you've got a strong central bank, an independent central bank. You have a floating exchange rate versus fixed. You have inflation targeting. And as a result, you have over 30 billion in reserves, the highest that we've seen in a decade. Looking at one more aspect, which I want to emphasize, which is personally very important to me, and I hear this both in what the president mentioned and also the prime minister, is this pivot to new generation economy, a digital economy, a new economy. We've often heard about Ukraine's ambitions to be Ukraine in a smartphone, the country in a smartphone. And certainly we've seen that. I think it's unprecedented what Ukraine has done on that front. It's hard to imagine a country that in only a few years has put all government procurement done electronically through ProZorro. They've won multiple world procurement awards for that. Imagine 137 billion of government purchases has gone through ProZorro, saving the state $8 billion. We saw 2 years ago a 29-year-old minister of digital transformation who is very much focused on digitalizing everything, all government services. 13 million Ukrainians are accessing 70 government services online through the DIA portal. That's unprecedented. Ukraine's in the top 5 in terms of digital passports, in terms of digital licenses. And DIA City, which the president and prime minister have mentioned, I mean, for us on the ground, it is enormous because, as everyone knows, digital, the investments in tech, those are extremely important, not only because they are becoming #3 in terms of export sector, but also because Ukraine wants and needs to keep talented young people, new generation leaders on the ground here in Ukraine. So an industry that back in 2003 was 110 million is now a $6 billion industry and growing. And this whole DIA City notion really came through this public-private partnership between industry associations, between companies, between parliament, president's administration, the prime minister, cabinet of ministers, to really construct a virtual city that has an effective tax rate of less than 8%, and essentially means that you are catalyzing IT exports and investments even more. So we're quite excited about that. And I think to finish, I believe that what Ukraine has done, the transformation that Ukraine has undertaken over the last 7-8 years, has really set the stage for a resilient economy, for a diversified economy, for an economy for the future, and also ensured that through the COVID pandemic, Ukraine was resilient and Ukraine is able to face whatever comes its way. So I'm quite bullish about being here in Ukraine today. And from my standpoint, I mean, we've, as you mentioned, over 1 billion of assets under management. You know, pre-2008, we had 650 million. In the last decade, we've raised $500 million. We've invested in over 150 companies in Ukraine and the near region, and you know, with companies that are employing almost 70,000 people. It's a very important country for us, and it will continue to be so.
Thank you. Thank you for those very upbeat words. Interesting, thought-provoking numbers you're giving us too. Thank you, Ms. Kojani. Now I'm wondering what a potential investor like Mr. Brockmeyer, what do you make of what you are hearing today? And what challenges are you facing as you consider doing business in Ukraine? Mr. Brockmeyer.
Yeah, also from my side, thank you very much for the invitation and for the opportunity to participate in this panel. We at Stadler Rail, we are producer of railway vehicles. railway vehicles like trains, metros, trams, and locomotives. And our mission is to make these railways more attractive and to get more people on the trains, to get more goods and more freight on the trains. And the railways are the most efficient mode of transport. And so if we make the railways more attractive, we help the climate and we reduce the carbon footprint of public transport. And Switzerland is a very good example how this can be done successfully. In Switzerland, the railways have the highest market share in public transport in all over Europe. And we at Stadler, we have contributed significantly to that by providing the majority of the railway vehicles to the Swiss railways. And now we would be, of course, very much interested to do the same in Ukraine, to help to make the Ukraine railways more attractive, more efficient, and more sustainable. And we have actually already started to do this by bringing one of our most modern trains to Ukraine. And here in the background of my video screen, you can see our Flirt multiple unit in delivery of Ukraine railways in the Kiev main station. We have sold more than 2,000 of these trains, basically all over the world. And we would be very happy to have these trains and to produce these trains in the Ukraine soon. Now, coming back to your question, what is needed for investment? Of course, we are business people, so we follow the market. And if there is a market, we come and we invest. So what we need in this market is basically two things. We need the stable market, and we need also the stability. You know, railway projects are long-term. They are always long-term. Railway vehicles, they last for 30 to 40 years, and they take several years to produce. So what we need in the first place is stability in terms of technical requirements and stability in terms of the business environment to set up long-term relationships and to help making the Ukraine railways more attractive. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Brockmeyer. Thank you. It's great to hear your perspective. Now, we've heard from you, you're one potential investor. Obviously, the country needs many more. And at this point, I'd like to bring in Ms. Wiesfedele, who is here with me in Bern. Tell me, Ms. Fedele, what kind of climate do Swiss investors look for in a country? And what is it about Ukraine that makes it interesting for Swiss small and medium-sized companies?
Well, I happily do that. So in general, one thing we have to say is that I do an experience-based intervention. So I'm going to tell you what approximately 6,000 Swiss companies we support every year think in general, but as well international companies that come to Switzerland are looking for. Because in the end, they're all looking for the same things. And we actually have heard just before from Stadler, one of the key topics. So first of all, they always look for market opportunities, right? So it can be investments in infrastructure, it can be the consumption size. Ukraine is has a very big population. Second of all, it's the partner ecosystem. So do Swiss companies find the right ecosystem with the partners they need for production, for services they want to establish. The third and very important thing is talents. So it can be, do you have the right IT talents for banking services? Are they as well reliable? Or, do they just run off to the next company who offers a little bit more money? And last, the fourth thing that is absolutely key is the environment. We've heard stability. Companies invest, so they need to know what's going to happen as next, so they're going to have the return on investment. They need rule of law. They need an ecosystem where they know their investments are safe and where there is as well, let's say, return to those investments, right? They need a very good infrastructure as well to do their business. Now, if we look at the Ukraine, there are very many positive things. And first of all, the reform traction, which as mentioned before, is very impressive indeed. So first of all, market opportunities are huge. It's a big country. GDP evolvement as well after the crisis is positive. Inflation is under control. Foreign exchange rate are under control. There are important agreements, the FTA agreement, there is an investment agreement. So it's actually a very good way to do business there, right? Partners are there. We have heard there are many Swiss companies like Clariant, like a Nestle, like as well a Geberit, who actually invest in their supply chain, part of their supply chains in the Ukraine. We've heard about companies that are investing heavily in the new business opportunities we see upcoming in infrastructure. Let's talk about Sika, let's talk about Stadler Rae. So I think these things are very positively evolving, as well the elements that are going on in agriculture area, in the clean tech area are very interesting for Swiss companies, and I think it would be great to have maybe a deep dive on those topics in June when the conference is happening. Now, talents are strong, particularly as well in the IT sector, which is interesting for the Ukraine because of the digital economy that is boosting, and in Central Europe, Ukraine is close to Europe, so when you look at the value chains, that's interesting. There is an increasing scarcity on IT specialists, so this is an advantage. So Swiss firms look as well from that perspective to the Ukraine. Now, when you look at the environment, there is a higher stability in the rule of law. Certainly, there are more investments and important reforms that have been done. We've heard the business ombudsman that is supporting. We heard about Ukraine Invest, etc. So there are many things ongoing. Problems that remain, and we certainly, I'm sure the government is going to look at this in its further endeavors, is that Swiss companies tells us that it's sometimes really difficult to deal with the situation in the law environment as it's complex and it's very frequently changing. It's not very clear, and this is important when we look at the PPPs in the infrastructure topic. What is the role of the public-owned enterprises? And certainly, and the government knows that and has highlighted an improvement when it comes to corruption would be a very important thing, to have the stability to make the investments, because many companies, in fact, are interested to invest. And if the path is being continued that the Ukraine is heading at the moment, I think there are much opportunities.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ms. Wiesfedele. And you mentioned the business ombudsman. You also mentioned rule of law. So I am right now going to bring in Mr. Roman Vashuk. Hello, good morning. And as a former Canadian ambassador to Ukraine until 2019, now you're the business ombudsman. Has the situation changed regarding, for instance, rule of law since you were there last? And what kind of problems do Canadian and international companies in general face? And perhaps you can just give us an idea of what your specific role is.
Well, thank you very much, Juliet, and it's an honor to be here in this distinguished company. We're a case-based organization, so let me start from that. I think it's worth noting that Ukraine, for example, actually has one of Europe's more advanced automated VAT refund systems, and that's taking care of a lot of the big-ticket, multi-million-dollar problems in that sector that I was encountering back in 2014, when things were very much being handled by individual bureaucrats. There was a lot happening, especially before 2014, on kickbacks in that area, major business concern. Now, we've actually seen an increase in tax cases over the past year, but it's been more around the edges of disputed taxes, where manual procedures are not yet automated and still prevail, and where there have been structural disincentives for tax offices to forfeit revenue and maybe then not hit their own KPIs. So maybe let's sort of unpack that as an example of what goes on. Let's say there's a company, large or small, Ukrainian or foreign owned, thinks it's been unfairly assessed. It goes to court, it wins the case, either in the first instance or on appeal. So in this case, the judicial system, which people talk about a lot, but in this case, it's actually worked. But then the money doesn't come back to the company, possibly because the tax office doesn't want to reduce its fund levels and, again, miss its own performance indicators. So that's where we come in. We point out this malpractice at both regional and national levels. If we don't get a positive response within 15 days, we take the case to a joint working group we have with tax service headquarters here in Kyiv. And then in the vast majority of cases, the refund is activated and received by our business client. So that's a problem, and it's quite repetitive. I've seen it even in the 2 weeks
I think we're having audio problems. Mr. Washu, can you hear me?
Yes,
Oh,
sorry,
here we are. You're back. Go ahead.
I must have, so as I said, that's why we don't just address individual cases, we do systemic reports on legislative and regulatory solutions. And so I'm very glad that I've already had a meeting with Prime Minister Šmihal to discuss how we can work together to implement them, and happy also that we'll be working together on getting a law passed to institutionalize the business ombudsman function in a more permanent way, which I think would be a lovely thing to be able to announce at Lugano. As far as law enforcement itself goes, we haven't seen any upward trend there. In fact, downward trend, which fewer cases we have, the better, as far as I'm concerned. Our most recent report on law enforcement, released just this month, shows a shift in complaints from people complaining about actions of the police and prosecutors, seizing IT or other equipment, paralyzing a company's work, which was very much a phenomenon in years past, to complaining about their inaction. So they're not investigating an alleged criminal or unfair practice by competitors or government bodies. Now, still a problem, but in a way it's evolving in a more positive direction. I think Ukraine is still vulnerable to what I would call enforcement eruptions, where seemingly disproportionate fines are levied to major businesses. I mean, our office in last year helped resolve the Nova Poshta case, where a broken aquarium generated a fine of over 10 million. And fortunately, there we were able to work with a very reform-minded head of the state consumer service who wanted to stamp out that kind of culture within her own organization, and managed to get that fine quickly rescinded. We'll also be working with the Prosecutor General's office, 2 events over the next 2 months, to bring together law enforcement and figure out how to attack some of those remaining systemic problems.
Thank you, Mr. Mashchuk. Thank you so much. And you mentioned that you've already had meetings with the Prime Minister. So let me just pull up a slide here that sums up the priorities of the Ukraine Reform Conference. So as you indicated, Mr. Prime Minister, in your opening words, the priorities focus on 2 pillars: stability, which can be achieved by fighting corruption, empowering local structures and pushing for stronger cohesion, and prosperity based on a green transition, investing in human capital, ensuring transparency and sound corporate governance, and a robust and modern banking and financial sector. All of this, of course, must be underpinned by digital transformation. And let's remember, Ukraine has a very successful sector in IT. Now, I would like to bring in the Prime Minister here, and Mr. Šmihal, if I can sum up what we've heard from you so far today. It's a mixture of good intentions and optimism, but also a lingering concern that key institutions must be protected or strengthened, and that reforms need to be accelerated in order to create the best conditions to promote a stable investment environment in Ukraine. Please, I'd like to hear from you now.
I would like to thank all the esteemed panelists and the moderator especially for the optimistic, cautious but optimistic commencement of the first conference in order to provide for stability in Ukraine. We presently are adopting a whole set of documents for future development, because this is the foundation to create the proper environment for investments. Today, we adopted the long-term strategic development program until 2030. This will provide for the opportunity for investors to have a predictable plan for future investments. And we have now switched to the 3-year budgetary planning. This is another reform. We plan for the budget and macroeconomic indicators for 3 years. This is again a very good signal for investors, and they can see how we will proceed in terms of macroeconomic indicators. And of course, today The majority of our panelists were referring to the importance, and this is also priority number one with us, to reform the judicial system, to create the business for business the proper venue. And so we are proceeding with the legislation. We have the commissions, the collective bodies, also with participation of our international partners supporting this reform and helping us with the implementation. And presently, we also pay a lot of attention. It was also mentioned to the anti-corruption reforms. It's not just for the infrastructure fight against corruption, but this is also digitalization. And as Lena Gojarnym said, the ProZorro instruments to avoid corruption and to save a lot of money. All these steps are, on the one hand, are signals for investors, on the other hand, are some kind of pillars to provide for stability in Ukraine. And undoubtedly, all this, like in the chart that you were demonstrating, should be in that kind of wrapping of digitalization, because this is part and parcel of economic development nowadays. And we would like to take the lead in paperless governance, digital economy, and we also attach a lot of attention to that. This is widely appreciated by the business community because this is much more convenient, easier, less human interference, excluding any kind of opportunities for corruption, because you cannot be corrupt digitally. And this will provide for proper conditions for business, and through the instruments of open dialogue with the business ombudsman, business associations, through the instrument like Ukraine Invest, we will be also already creating the infrastructure to support business, facilitate development of business, provide hints for business, and all these things will provide us with the opportunity to say that business climate, business environment in Ukraine is changing, has changed already, and will be changing for the future with a great pace. In the nearest future, we'll see a totally different set of indicators. In conclusion, I would like to say that stability of Ukraine, like stability of Europe, depends on our relations between business, the general public, civil society, our societies, our jurisdictions. We have to develop that, to support that, and this is another great pillar providing for stability under condition not just of some legal risks, but also possible aggressive actions coming from the Russian Federation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. Thank you so much for those thought-provoking words. Let me bring in our potential Swiss investor, Mr. Brockmeyer. What are you hearing today? What are your views? What are your thoughts now? Are you more confident?
Yes, absolutely. Look, we are a railway company, as I already pointed out, and normally we are very much focused on this railway sector. In panels like this, we get information from other sectors. We get information about the developments in the legal framework on the financing side. And of course, this is all contributing to our confidence to increase our efforts in the railway sector and to continue the path that has started a couple of months ago for the investment in Ukraine.
So I'm wondering, Ms. Wiesfedel, if I can bring you in. What are the concerns you're hearing mostly from Swiss SMEs, whether they're thinking about investing, thinking about importing? What are you hearing on that front?
Happily take that up. I've highlighted it shortly before, but I now can make the relation to what have been said to when it comes to the reform program of the Ukraine. So I do think that the reform program tackles important elements that are of today's concern, right? So the rule of law, the corruption element and as well the transparency of state-owned companies, right? So that Swiss enterprises would have the same level playing field as potentially their partners or competitors in the Ukraine. So I think that's very important. Furthermore, I think it's important to keep the incentives up that have been created in the past. So I think it would be great maybe as well to use roundtables like that and maybe incoming missions to have maybe as well some companies being able to discuss about very concrete business opportunities in the area of the public-private partnerships in infrastructure, be it clean transport, be it clean energy. So I think the main wish is keep on with the ongoing business reforms. Of course, the geopolitical situation at the moment might keep some companies wait a little bit. But there are many companies like Stadler who are used to challenging environments and that they know that it's still an important time to make investments because the base for a successful future very often is made in times of crisis where you actually can go stronger with important reforms. So what they need is keep on with your reforms, provide the stability, and please welcome us as important partners to bring together the country forward.
So indeed, and if I can bring in Ms. Kojarny here, we were just hearing about rule of law. To what extent is it a challenge in your business, and what advice would you give to entrepreneurs who are looking at Ukraine for opportunities, but perhaps fear vested interests and other risks?
Thank you, Juliet. So I think context is everything. So it's important to understand, what our business is. I mean, firstly, we're growth equity investors. So we invest alongside visionary entrepreneurs in Ukraine and the region. So we're investing in the Ukrainian companies. We are investing in their production facilities. We're investing in plants that they're opening. We're investing in pickup points that they're building, retail locations across the country. So we are backing them in Ukraine. We're helping them to grow. We're helping them to expand. We're helping them with corporate governance. And then we're ultimately together IPOing or selling to strategic or realizing, setting on a new journey in the future. So I think it's important that from our perspective, we're not selling something into Ukraine. It is backed by investors who are very sophisticated, U.S. European. They have over 600 billion in capital. So the way that we look at it is we look at it in a very factual-based way. We go past the headlines, we go past the hype. We really have to understand the facts and figures, and that's the business that we're in. So when I look back at 150 transactions, we ended up in courts once back in 1997, and that situation was ultimately resolved to our satisfaction. All of our legal fees were paid, and that's the experience that we have. I'm also chair of the American Chamber of Commerce in Ukraine. Rule of law is extremely important. It's first and foremost for our members who've invested over $50 billion in the country, about 600 members together. And we often do surveys. We survey the CEOs. It is the big issue. Everybody wants to see rule of law. That is the number one issue. I know Prime Minister Shmyhal last year at Vilnius, we heard the expression that rule of law is the mother of all reforms. And I thank Prime Minister, as he often says that as well. And I think it's very important that the focus is on it. I want to also go back to what Mr. Vashuk said, very important, and that's the systemic change. So for us as business people, and the advice that I have, I mean, first of all, Ukraine is moving down a systemic path. Granted that you can't change 9,000 judges overnight. You've changed 2,000 so far. You have 2,000 vacancies, and we're all watching that systemic change. We're very buoyed by the fact that in 2021, the parliament, backed by the president, backed by the cabinet, they passed two very important laws, which is really the reform of the High Qualification Commission of Judges and also the High Council of Justice. And the key for us as business people is that 50% of those councils are foreign experts. That's extremely important to have the viewpoint of international experts. If you think of these commissions, I mean, you think of them as the HR function for the judicial system, for the judges, for the courts, and to have international experts be part of all of those appointments is extremely important. Then you look at it from the other side is the disciplinary body, and to decide on the fate of a judge in terms of those that have been brought forward from a disciplinary perspective. And again, it's very important that there are international experts there and that they have the casting vote. What else do we look at? I mean, we look at, what's important to us is pragmatic. Okay, so systemic change is important. It's moving in the right direction, but also if you run into a problem, what do you do now? And if I look at when I came in 1993, if I look at 8 years ago, it's night and day. Anyone who comes to Ukraine, you have an office of the business ombudsman that is 24/7, that is extremely accessible, that folks can turn to if there's an issue and have very quick and successful resolution. If you have an issue in the courts, then you can go to the Office for Protection of Investor Rights, which is set up under the General Prosecutor's Office. That's very important because sometimes, I mean, the country can't fix everything at the same time. What you may see in Kiev, when you go out in the regions, you may have someone somewhere in the system in the middle of nowhere who decides that it may be a good idea to harass a company. But there are these kinds of avenues that people can follow. So I mentioned that Office for Protection of Investor Rights. That's extremely important. We've brought as American Chamber of Commerce in Ukraine 38 cases forward, and almost 20 of them have been solved. And all it did, nobody's looking for any favors. Nobody's looking for a manual system. What folks are looking for is for any issues that are of a type that quite frankly may be incredulous to see, that they have a light shone upon them, that it's clear, that it's transparent, that the facts are brought forward, and people ultimately understand that these are companies who've invested extensively and deserve at least to have something looked at. So that's I think, my point is that it's not only the systemic change, but it's also this commitment that we've seen throughout the institutions to ensure that there are these pragmatic approaches that can be taken. So from my standpoint, look, I think that anyone coming to Ukraine, they should adopt the same approach that they would adopt in any country. Coming to a new country obviously is a significant undertaking. And, first and foremost, it's important to have partners that you trust, to spend the time to due diligence who you're working with, who you go into business with, who you embark on this journey with. That's very important. It's important in our case, we've largely stayed out of politicized sectors. We understand the environment, we understand the competition, we understand the players, and we may choose not to go there. We may choose to say, you know what, let's watch this sector, but we like these three sectors more. We like e-commerce, we like manufacturing, we like retail, etc. Tech, banking. I mean, those are sectors that we're very comfortable in. So I think that's important. And also it's important to join forces with like-minded people. It's very important to come together, to be united like we are in American Chamber of Commerce in Ukraine and other leading business associations. And really, if there's any issues, to bring them up quickly and resolve them in a honest, transparent, forthright manner. The last thing I'll say is this, is that, look, corruption is a two-way street. If there's somebody asking, then your answer is always no. If there's anyone asking, then there's always two sides to it. Someone shouldn't be paying and someone shouldn't be asking. And that's important. So, I mean, we feel very comfortable with the institutional investors that we have, with the companies that we back, with the environment that we're in. We see it changing both systemically and also we see pragmatic avenues for investors coming into the country now.
Powerful words, Ms. Kojarny, thank you. And you mentioned the 24/7 business ombudsman. I'm going to bring in Mr. Vashuk right here. Mr. Vashuk, Rome wasn't built in a day. Progress obviously takes time. What are your thoughts? What makes you think that prosperity is achievable in Ukraine? And what are you hoping for this year and beyond? We're having trouble with your audio again. Let's see if we can.
Yes, I'm here to represent problematic Zoom users the world over. So I think it's appropriate, having mentioned Rome not being built in a day, that it comes to me as a Roman to answer it. And I'm a former lifer in the Canadian public service, so I know about the difficulties of public service change. I wouldn't have come back to Ukraine if I didn't believe in the potential of a nation of smart and resilient people. Brains and grains was a snappy formula that emerged after 2014. And you can see the direction of travel in that transition as, for example, IT and agri-food company entrepreneurs climb the Ukrainian Forbes list and start displacing the smokestack industry oligarchs who've traditionally dominated and to some extent form the country's image abroad. Now, there's a Canadian bank that has been running ads with the line, "You're richer than you think." And I think that's actually also the case with Ukraine. Ukraine needs, though, the legal stability, the regulatory stability, so that both Ukrainians, especially Ukrainians, feel secure enough to show their real assets. And that we are able to realize the full potential that's out there. And so what I appreciate here is that there's scope for change, there's openness to course corrections, our ombudsman's office ability to successfully resolve over 1,000 cases a year as an independent body is evidence that people in government are willing to listen and to fix problems. So in order to release that full potential that Ukraine has, I think we need to work together harder on streamlining systems, getting the incentives right. And if we get that done, the sky's the limit, or maybe faster railway lines to the future are where it's going to be at.
Thank you for those encouraging words, Mr. Vashuk. Now, let's just give our viewers a quick overview of what the Ukraine Reform Conferences are all about.
So much has already been done, and we have a precise plan for our future efforts. The scope of work is very broad, but definitely manageable. We clearly see where to move next, what needs to be done, and which steps are to be taken one by one. The 5th Ukraine Reform Conference will be held in Lugano, and it will focus on the topics highlighted in the 2030 Ukraine National Economic Strategy. The President of Ukraine, the government, our international partners, private sector and civil society will discuss the progress of social transformations, the reform priorities for the next year, and Ukraine's contribution to the development of the region as a whole.
The Swiss approach is based on a couple of elements. First of all, we want to build a positive process. So a process that is for Ukraine and for the reforms in Ukraine. Second, we would like it to be an inclusive process. So we want to reach out to all stakeholders of the Ukrainian society. Being business, being academia, and local and central authorities.
Now we're coming to an end to this roundtable, and I have to say, we've had a lot of questions popping up on Slido. It's great to see. And if we start looking at them, I see we've immediately got one question that perhaps you, Ms. Vice Fedele, could answer. And an anonymous Viewer is asking, how useful are roundtables like this one for Swiss SMEs who are thinking of investing abroad, like in a country like Ukraine? What do you think?
Okay, so I get the tricky one right for the beginning. So I think it's two things. The first thing that is important, that it enables potentially interested SMEs to validate their interest in investing in the Ukraine. What is important to understand, and I think as well from our partners in the Ukraine, that a Swiss SME normally starts to do business not in every country in the world, so they choose very wisely where they invest. Then they normally start to doing exports, right? And when they see that the market evolves well, they start to invest locally, right? So I think in the roundtables like this, they first of all, they see the government side and their plans on where the country is moving and if there is enough stability for them making this investment. Because if the investment is going wrong for particularly small companies, this is a high risk, right? So this is the validation part. They hear as well from partners doing business in the country what the tackling is. On the other side, you can ask, well, why I'm here and why do I think it's a good investment of our time, right, to engage in such a round table. And it's a high investment and it's such an important investment because business is about people. Right? So I think roundtables like this offer us opportunities to engage with potential partners, and then as well, when, let's say, the conference is happening, see if there are maybe a side event where we can create a potential deep dive in certain business opportunities in Ukraine, or potentially as well have certain companies present themselves for, let's say, infrastructure projects to the authorities to see if there's some deep dive information or matchmaking, right? So I think it's about creating opportunities to enable business.
That's good to know. That's good to know. Now, I see there's a question here from Mr. Prime Minister, and I'm going to read you the question. It's, how can Ukraine win the competition for investment? For instance, in Poland or Turkey, they have effective tools like industrial parks. What is your government planning? Mr. Prime Minister.
Indeed, we are actively introducing new instruments to fight in this regional competition, to compete regionally with the industrial parks, and we are doing everything to make them work not just on paper, but in reality. At least 25 industrial parks in every region of Ukraine, in every province, starting from this year. In the forthcoming 3 years, we will arrange the proper infrastructure from $2.5 million US an equivalent. Additionally, we develop PPPs, private-public partnerships in extraction of natural mineral resources and the production sharing agreements with the general scope of investment for development and primary infrastructure more than 10 billion US in equivalent. We are actively developing the projects for concessions and seaports, airport infrastructure and motorways. And we are actively working with the European Alliance for batteries and for hydrogen production. We have many regional advantages, and we're actively working with digitalization. And the panelists have already referred to that we have to take leading positions, not just in the region, but we will be provided with the opportunities to do it and have the competitive advantages. We understand all the categories of economy, and we will do everything to compete successfully with our partners, neighbors, and friends. But this is a business opportunity, and we'll be very pragmatic and to do everything that we need here from what the business have to say and take the advice.
We have another question coming in, and it's about macroeconomic stability. If I can just read it to you, macroeconomic stability is an important indicator. What is your government doing to maintain macroeconomic stability, Mr. Prime Minister?
Прості речі, я вже про них говорив.
Simple things I have already mentioned. The macroeconomic stability is about stability of the market, of the investors, investment, and development by and large. We can talk about long-term strategies, programs, 3-year budgetary declaration, 10-year, the 10-year program strategically, also cooperation with the National Bank of Ukraine. The central bank is responsible for financial stability, stability of the banking sector. In 2014, we experienced quite a deep banking crisis when about 100 banks had to leave the market. And presently, for 8 years in a row now, despite the pandemic and the military aggression, the banking system of Ukraine remains stable. The National Bank of Ukraine has been reformed fully and provides for macroeconomic, financial, and general economic stability. We are in close cooperation with them. We work on the macroeconomic stability based on the Ministry of Economy and the Ministry of Finance. And despite all the external crisis influences, the energy crisis, the pandemic, and the aggression, and the temporarily occupied territories in Ukraine, macroeconomic stability is sustained. In Ukraine, we have fulfilled the indicators for inflation that we promised. We understand the exchange rate for hryvnia and the necessary line of development. So we are supporting financial stability of our state. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. And I'm going to bring in Mr. Roman Vashuk at this point because we've got a question coming in and it's about business sectors. And this person is asking which business sectors are most promising in the country. Over to you, Mr. Vashuk.
Okay, well, I've already mentioned IT, and I think Lena has evoked how well they've done in that sector, her company, but also many others, also many multinationals, and agri-food. That in turn relates to land reform, which was passed last year and is being actively implemented. So those would be, I think there's also considerable potential for nearshoring to the EU, given the DCFTA that exists. So those would be a nearshoring for manufacturing, and essentially Ukraine is already part of Central European, for example, auto manufacturing value chains. And I think there's more potential for development there.
Thank you, Mr. Vashuk. Now, I've got another question coming in, and this perhaps I'll address it to Mrs. Vice-Fedele. Which sectors of Ukrainian industry are a priority in terms of developing relations with Switzerland?
So I think when it comes to have relations with Switzerland, right, I do believe that when it comes to public-private partnerships, that one is important, right? So I think really being engaged and looking together how our very strong, let's say, infrastructure and clean tech sector can collaborate with the Ukraine to get the green priorities that the government has put as a priority in their reform programs. With companies like Stade Rail, but as well in the energy sector, where there are many very interesting companies. That's, let's say, more public part, right? But then in the end, I think it's about the relationship with the companies. And so I think it's going to be interesting, particularly in the area of collaborations along the value chain, in the industrial sector, be it services, be it production. And I really believe in the digital part. So I think, yes, IT is very important. It helps as well in the banking environment. But I've heard the digital priority, which is key. So if you see it as a digital support in the industrial sector, it's going to support the attractiveness of the Ukraine industrial sector for Swiss companies. It's going to support in the service sector. And I think promoting this and enabling, let's say, matchmaking opportunities, this is an area where I would invest personally.
Great, thank you for that. And I'm going to now bring in Mr. Brockmeyer and Ms. Kojarny. The question is, what would be the best tangible result of the conference in Lugano that takes place in July for the private sector? Can we start with Mr. Brockmeyer, maybe? What would you most like to see?
That's a good question. Of course, we being active in the we would like to see our railway projects developing. We have currently just started to bid for large projects in the Ukraine, one in the city area for tramways, one for long distance and regional trains. And of course, we would like to see these projects to progress. We would like to see stability in the railway plans, in the staffing of the railways, in the management team of the railways, things that has not been present in the past, but we see them now, and we would like to see them progressing.
Thank you, Mr. Brockmeyer. Ms. Kojarny.
Yes, from my standpoint, I've been to all the reform conferences. For me, it's less about, I'd love to see them called transformation conferences or partnership conferences. Frankly, I'm waiting for the day for it to be called the partnership conference, because I think that's what Lugano is all about. It's to see the real Ukraine on the ground, to meet people who have invested a great deal in this country, know it very well, to greater understand the risks, to greater understand how to mitigate them, to understand that with risks come opportunities, and those opportunities are great. With headlines come less competition, and with valuations skyrocketing around the globe, I think folks are looking for places where there are a lot of opportunities, limited competition, and a immense upside. So for me, Lugano is about partnership, and I would be looking at it from that standpoint. I want to just pick up on two things that were mentioned before, and I think the Prime Minister did a great job in terms of emphasizing the macroeconomic stability. I can't emphasize this enough. I mean, Ukraine during the COVID-19 pandemic, which is still ongoing, did not have the stimulus, the fiscal stimulus that other countries pumped into the economies. I mean, it was business continued. They didn't pump in 15% of their GDP as other countries could allow themselves to do. They put less than 3% because obviously the country is focusing on the macroeconomic stability, but also is conscious about the reserves and its spending, et cetera. You know, the fact that the IMF is its partner, the fact that they submitted a budget and approved a budget that was within the 3.5% deficit target, the inflation targeting, I mean, the independent central bank, the macroeconomic stability is here. It's been here for a while, and it will continue, and you only have to look at the COVID-19 pandemic to be comfortable with it. One other thing that I wanted to say, I think, Ms. Simone, you absolutely nailed it in terms of describing what's important to Swiss companies to kind of put the toe in the water, to begin relationships, and then think of a production base, et cetera, here. We're delighted to see that happen with Swiss companies. We were very pleased to build a first-class pharma company with our partners here and have Stade come in and purchase that facility in Bielefeld, which is starting to become a biotech and pharma and manufacturing hub. And that was an extremely exciting transaction, and that they not only invested in the ground, in a production facility, in a plant, in people, and they're using this as their regional base. It's very exciting. And then Vetropack, we're very pleased to have sold the plant to Vetropack as well in the region. So I think that those that see the opportunities and are willing to listen, to speak to those people on the ground are going to find an abundance of them here in Ukraine.
Thank you so much, Ms. Kojarny. Now, we have one more question for Mr. Prime Minister. What are the next concrete steps of the government regarding rule of law? If I can bring you in now, Mr. Dennis. Mr. Prime Minister?
Отже, сьогодні уряд
Today, presently the government, according to the effective legislation of Ukraine, in the scope of their responsibilities, are implementing all the reforms actively, joining the reforms where the Ministry of Justice can join in for the rule of law. The government is also involved in full scope, and we are very active presently in our cooperation with the international partners. The IMF program is continued. We are actively working with the EBRD, the World Bank, EU, European Investment Banks, and a lot of other international financial institutions and international partners supporting Ukraine along the road of reforms, providing consultative and practical support in implementation. Our role is that of the coordinator, and we coordinate cooperation with all the partners inside and outside Ukraine. And that's the key role that we assign to ourselves as the government of Ukraine for implementation of the reforms that we have comprehensively discussed, inclusive of judicial reform, anti-corruption reform, land reform, decentralization reform, educational and medical reforms, and more than 20 other reforms which are being simultaneously implemented in our country. Thank you very much.
For that upbeat conclusion, Mr. Prime Minister. And that brings us to the end of this Davos online roundtable. But there will be more discussions in the coming weeks and months as we continue on the road to Lugano to the URC 2022. For the next preparatory events, please check out our website. That's www.urc2022.com. Thank you to all our panelists for this fruitful discussion. Thank you to all our viewers for sending in so many great questions. I'm Juliet Lindley. Goodbye from Bern and from Kiev, and thanks so much for watching.
Some say we're brave. Yes, brave entrepreneurs. We're totally authentic. Authentic engineers. And of course, we're boundless. Boundless dreamers. Sometimes we're uncommon. Uncommon inventors. Or revolutionary. Revolutionary creators. Change your perspective. Start up with Ukraine now.